Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. Look, we're diving into something truly fascinating. But yeah, it's definitely a bit sobering too. We are going to break down the sheer nuts and bolts economic mechanics of British colonial rule in India. We're talking about how an entire massive subcontinent's traditional economy was just completely and systematically rewired. Let's get into it. So here's the big question. How in the world does a trading company, just a corporate entity, the East India Company, manage to dismantle and completely restructure the economy of a whole subcontinent? I mean, they didn't just walk in and take over the government. They fundamentally transformed India from a thriving, self-sufficient society into this massive, conquered territory with one single goal: generating revenue.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. Number 1, from traders to rulers. 2, 3 land revenue systems. 3, the rise of cash crops. 4, impact on tribal societies. 5, decline of traditional handicrafts. And finally, number 6, the path to rebellion. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, from traders to rulers, shifting the economy.
Picture this. Before colonialism, rural life in India was actually incredibly self-sufficient. Villages basically produced everything they needed right there. You had thriving local trades, beautiful handicrafts, the whole shebang. But as the British Empire expanded, the amount of money they needed to fund their military and their administration just skyrocketed. So villages were annexed, and that self-sufficient rural economy, it was totally shattered. The land itself literally became the #1 source of income for the company.
Moving on to Section 2, 3 land revenue systems, the ultimate tax squeeze. To squeeze out all that revenue, the British rolled out 3 massive, rigid systems. First up, introduced by Lord Cornwallis way back in 1793, is the permanent settlement, or Zemindari system, which hit mostly Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Under this, local landlords, the zamindars, were made the actual owners of the land. So overnight, peasants were reduced to mere tenants on their own ancestral farms. Then, in 1820, you have the Ryatwari system down in South India. Here, they collected taxes directly from the peasants, but the rates were absolutely crushing. We're talking 50 to 60%. Finally, in 1822 came the Mahalwari system in the Gangetic Valley, the Northwest, and Punjab, where entire village committees collected the tax. But honestly, no matter which system it was, the impact on the peasants was exactly the same: high demands, total exploitation, and ultimately losing their land. Now check out this number, 89%. The sheer scale of this tax squeeze is just staggering. Under the Zemindari system, 89% of the total revenue squeezed from the peasants went straight to the British government. The Zemindars kept the remaining 11%. So what about the actual farmers? The ones doing all the backbreaking work? They were left with virtually nothing. It got so bad they were often forced to take out high-interest loans from moneylenders, literally just to pay the rent. Unbelievable, right?
To really grasp that third one, the Mahalwari system introduced by Halt Mackenzie, you got to know what a mahal is. It's basically a group of villages. So the tax settlement wasn't with a single landlord or an individual farmer, it was collective. The entire village community was jointly responsible for paying the land revenue. Sounds somewhat fair in theory, maybe, but because the British tax demand was so overwhelmingly high, this collective responsibility ultimately just turned into collective ruin.
Which brings us to Section 3, the rise of cash crops, dictating the harvest.
So the East India Company soon realized they could maximize their profits even more by forcing farmers to completely abandon their food crops. Instead, they had to grow forced commercial crops. Why? Well, to feed European industries, of course. They pushed opium, which they smuggled straight into China for massive profit. They demanded indigo, that's a blue dye, for Britain's booming textile factories. They required raw cotton to be exported directly to England, along with giant plantations for tea and Assam in South India, plus sugarcane and pepper.
The core of all this commercial exploitation was a truly vicious cycle. The British used extremely coercive methods to buy these raw materials from the farmers at incredibly low prices. Then they'd ship the stuff off to England, run it through their factories to make finished goods, bring those goods right back to India, and sell them at super high prices. When you look at the big picture, the Indian farmer basically subsidized the entire British Industrial Revolution. They fetched absolute pennies for their crops while living totally miserable lives to feed European industries.
All right, Section 4, impact on tribal societies, uprooting the forests.
This massive economic extraction didn't stop at the farmlands. It stretched way into India's deep forests. These forests were home to incredibly diverse tribal groups, like the Santals, the Mundas, and the Khasis. For literally generations, their whole economy was built around these forests. They practiced shifting cultivation, they herded animals, and the land belonged to the clan as a whole. But the British wanted that timber for their new railway sleepers. So what did they do? They just declared the forests as state property, reserved forests. Almost overnight, traditional tribal chiefs lost all their power. Whole communities were uprooted from their ancestral homes and forced to become cheap laborers.
To really grasp the human cost of this uprooting, just consider the Santal silk growers in Jharkhand. These folks were rearing silkworms. British traders and their local middlemen would swoop in, hand out small cash loans to the growers, and then collect the cocoons. And get this, they paid the growers just 3 rupees for 1,000 cocoons. 3 rupees! Then they'd turn right around and sell them for 5 times the price. When the tribal groups finally realized the sheer scale of this middleman theft, it's honestly no surprise they started viewing these traders as their absolute worst enemies.
This leads us to Section 5, Decline of Traditional Handicrafts, Deindustrialization.
Okay, let's compare 2 totally different eras. Back in the 17th century, the global trade balance heavily favored India. The whole world desperately wanted Indian goods, fine cotton, silk, spices, you name it. But fast forward to the 19th century, and the picture is just tragic. To protect their own new factories back home, the British slapped extremely heavy duties on Indian goods. At the exact same time, they flooded the Indian market with cheap, machine-made British stuff from the Industrial Revolution. Indian artisans simply couldn't compete with that. They were ruined, forced to give up traditional livelihoods in what became the literal deindustrialization of India.
Now, to be fair, modern industries did eventually take root. Tea became this massive plantation industry in places like Assam, and through the sheer grit of visionaries like Jamshedji Tata, modern giants like the Tata Iron and Steel Company emerged. But, and this is crucial, we have to remember that this new modernization happened squarely in the shadow of the total destruction of India's original traditional livelihoods.
And finally, Section 6, The Path to Rebellion, The Breaking Point.
For millions of people, the reality boiled down to a devastating equation. Think about it. You start with natural calamities, right? Floods and droughts. Then add those unbearably high taxes we talked about. Throw in the crushing repayment of loans from the moneylenders. When people couldn't pay, they faced total eviction from their land. The result? Proud, independent farmers and forest-dwelling tribals were turned into desperate, landless laborers. And as you can imagine, all that frustration finally boiled over into absolute rage.
And that rage sparked resistance. But this resistance wasn't just a couple of isolated incidents. It was continuous. In 1829, you have the Khasi revolt up in the northwest Assam hills. In 1857, this widespread exploitation fueled a mass uprising, the First War of Independence. By 1859, the Bengal riots literally refused to grow indigo during the Blue Rebel Uprising. Then in 1875, the Deccan riots exploded specifically against rural indebtedness. Fast forward to 1920, and you start seeing formal political organization, like the formation of the Oud Kisan Sabha under Jawaharlal Nehru.
So what started as desperate, localized economic revolts against oppressive landlords and crazy taxes eventually matured. They grew into formal peasant associations known as Kisan Sabhas. These groups started cropping up everywhere, and they formed the absolute crucial grassroots groundwork that eventually fueled the much broader Indian independence struggle of the 20th century.
We've seen exactly how land, crops, and human labor were systematically turned into these massive extraction mechanisms. So I want to leave you with a question to ponder. How does this 19th century blueprint of economic extraction still echo in modern global trade and agricultural practices today? Seriously, when we look at our modern global supply chains for the tea we drink or the cotton we wear, how much of that colonial legacy actually still lingers? It's something to think about for sure. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this gave you a clear, structured look into a deeply complex piece of history. See you next time.